Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Gregg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. I brought Richard Grosso back on. He was one of my first guests many years ago, environmental heavyweight in Florida. I don't know, Richard, you gave me you raised your eyebrows on that. Heavyweight, being a champion for the environment. A lot of people do environmental law and, I'm an environmental lawyer, but they're really working for the bad guys and, they're destroying the environment and they come up with some mitigation plan to get approval or whatever. That's not what Richard does. Richard fights the good fight, and he's been fighting it. One of my early mentors, we had a great time years ago fighting down in the Keys. So I figured, hey, we got a new administration coming in, so things are going to change, but some things are going to stay the same. And I know that the Everglades is always a major issue. Richard, how you doing? I'm going to give you the floor, and I want you to update us on what's going on in the environment in Florida, what we are going to do to combat what we can about Trump's anti-environmental program 2025, and what you're doing. You moved into the private world. So I want to hear, a little bit about what you're doing also. Whatever order you want to go with, let's let it rip. You got the floor.
Great. Well, I was a little concerned that heavyweight was about my current physical appearance, but I'm working on it now that I'm living part-time up in DC. I'm walking a lot more and getting a little more exercise. So I'm working on it, Greg. Good to see you again. It's obviously an exciting and challenging time for people who care about the environment, which really should be everybody. One of the frustrating things for me and so many others who've worked on the environment for so much of our careers is that people tend to see it as something that only certain people should care about. People who care about nature and wildlife and that kind of thing. And it's really frustrating that most people don't seem to understand that environmental issues are human health issues. We have pretty decent life expectancies in this country. They would be a lot better if the air we were breathing and the water we were drinking and the stuff we were exposed to as we go about working in our yards and moving around our communities was a lot cleaner and less polluted. And so those things matter to your life and your kids' lives. And I'm hoping that people can really start getting those messages and understanding that. You mentioned the incoming presidential administration. I really feel like the human health and the economic impacts that come from allowing more pollution, allowing the loss of natural lands, trees, native vegetation, the agricultural and other sort of essential functions that things like bees provide for us. I'm not sure that too many voters thought of that stuff when they were deciding who to vote for or whether to vote at all in November. And I feel like educating the public, it sounds trite, and we've talked about that for decades, but I really feel like long-term trends in the kinds of people we are electing at federal offices, state, local, are not going to change and stay the way they need to be unless the public gets a lot more savvy to the importance of environmental protection, ecological functions, land use decisions. I think if people really understood what those decisions meant for their health, for their own pocketbooks, and I'm talking about things like increased healthcare dollars and insurance premiums, those kinds of things that most people I don't think associate with environmental policy. I think that prior to the next election, we need to do as much as we can to educate the public on the economic and health and other benefits of environmental protection, and the damage we're doing to ourselves by making the wrong decisions on those things. So starting sort of at that level, one of the things that I think a lot of people are asking themselves, if you care about the environment and human health, what are you going to do over the next 4 years? And there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of lack of clarity there. A lot of people are trying to figure that out right now. I think that one of the positives, I'll start with some of the positive things there, is that the green energy conversion that the Biden administration has really helped accelerate. It has created a lot of jobs. There's been a lot of funding. There's been a lot of jobs created in a lot of congressional districts around the country, a lot of red congressional districts around the country. There's funding, there's subsidies for clean energy types of projects, for conversions of how factories make the things they make. And I think that the value of that, and I would also include in that a lot of funding that this administration has provided for things like local parks and preserves. Those, you now have constituencies in a lot of congressional districts around the country who are really benefiting by that kind of funding, by those kinds of programs, by those kinds of jobs. And I think that that will help push back on what you might expect to be a lot of the pressure to curtail or limit that funding or cut it completely, to stop those kinds of projects. On one level, lawyers like us, we think a lot about regulations and laws, but the bottom line is if you can help create economies at a local level that are in sync with environmental protection, with the type of energy policy we need to have, that tends to self-sustain itself. And that's a positive thing. It's a really positive thing. It's probably the most positive thing we have going for us right now, if you're concerned about the next 4 years in terms of federal policy, federal funding. Another good thing is kind of a reverse good thing. For so many years, lawyers who work at the federal level, involved with federal agency actions and bringing legal challenges to them. There's been a doctrine for many years, maybe 40 some years, called the Chevron doctrine, one that says environmental and other technical and specialized issues that federal government agencies deal with, they're so specialized that when agencies make decisions under the laws that Congress wrote, courts should be deferring to the agency judgment because they're the experts on that stuff. And a lot of conservative political thinkers have not liked that, and the United States Supreme Court finally overturned that doctrine last session. And the timing is pretty good for those who are concerned that the federal agencies now for the next 4 years will be making what people who care about the environment think are really bad decisions. The fact that federal courts are no longer required to defer to the agency interpretations of ambiguous federal laws, that's going to turn out to be a good thing, at least for the next 4 years. So that outcome might work in reverse for the benefit of people who are trying to enforce environmental laws. On the concerning side are going to be things like what we've seen in terms of people who are being appointed to Department of Energy, EPA, other related federal agencies, folks who, from their prior history and public statements, do not seem to be either people who understand climate and ecological issues, or who, for whatever economic or political reasons, have claimed they don't, and they don't believe them. That's obviously going to be a problem. And then the other appointments thing that could be a problem would be if the next president is going to appoint to the federal judiciary, obviously the Supreme Court, but also just as important, or almost as important, appeals judges and trial level judges at the federal level. If those appointments are going to be people who are anti-regulation, who don't believe that climate change is a real thing, who don't understand it, who think environmental protection is some sort of luxury that we shouldn't be indulging in, those are going to be problems. And so I think for a lot of people, obviously this depends on where you live, what state and what part of any state, uh, progress in terms of real progress on issues like that we care about is likely to be made at the state level and local government level. Probably wishful thinking to think we're going to be making a lot of actual progress on environmental protection at the federal level over the next few years. But I'm sure there will be some positive surprises along the way, and we shouldn't give up. Um, Now, so let's come down to Florida. What are the pressing issues facing our state right now? Climate and sea level rise, you would put right at the top. Florida is uh, the place probably with the most at risk of any other state in the country for climate and sea level rise. Sea level rise, obviously, the amount of coastline that we have, uh, the projections of sea level rise are pretty alarming. They're site specific. So the amount of sea level rise increase we're going to see in Key West is going to be more than what we might see like northern Palm Beach County, but still overall for the entire coastline, Gulf and Atlantic and Florida, it's a lot over the next 40 years, the 2050, the 2070 projections, the 2100 projections. We're talking about big differences. We're talking about billions of dollars of real estate value, um, uh, uh, investment, private investment, public investment, like roads and sewage plants and water plants and that kind of thing, that are gonna be underwater in a matter of years, a matter of decades. And that's obviously, an issue. One of the things I try to emphasize to people is, if you're one of the folks who either really believes or just uh, for whatever economic or political reason, you've got to continue to assert that humans are not the dominant cause of climate change. Okay, fine. Put that aside. You're wrong, but put that aside. But there's no denying that there is a climate crisis and a sea level rise crisis in the state of Florida and the world that cannot be denied. You can measure it, you can see it, and one of the problems with the sort of the state of politics on those issues is that when a federal government or a state government uh, is run by folks who just want to pretend this isn't happening, want to ignore it, that keeps them from dealing with the impacts too. If you want to say we're not going to do anything, and sadly, I think our current governor has said this a number of times. Uh, I consider climate greenhouse gas reduction strategies to be woke policy. We're not doing that in Florida. And I think what happens is, and I want to say the state of Florida has done some good things on this, but too often what can happen is we're not going to deal with trying to reduce how much worse we're making it. But also then what gets subsumed in that is we're not going to deal with the impacts either. So you cut funding for climate and sea level rise science. You cut funding for collecting data. You don't put those issues on policy agendas for actually taking action. So you're also then not dealing with the consequences. You're not dealing with things like people who have to work in increasing heat, which is a huge, huge, huge human health issue. You're not dealing with the people that are going to lose huge property values and lose places to live and have to deal with gentrified communities because of actual sea level rise. You know, you're not dealing with rising insurance costs that are making it incredibly increasingly difficult for non-wealthy people to live anywhere near water
Yeah.
in Florida. And so the whole climate thing isn't our fault, then too often, not always, but too often, then devolves into we're also not going to deal with it, whatever the cause. And so even if you're one of those people who wants to pretend that, oh, this is all just natural variability of climate, and you ignore the fact that, you know, the changes we've seen in climate over a matter of decades, yeah, the natural variability of that took place over, you know, millions of years, and you don't see the difference, okay, whatever. But then that when that causes you to elect people that are even going to prevent us from dealing with the actual obvious impacts, that's my biggest long-term fear, I think, for us in Florida in terms of the people that we're electing to those issues, so to deal with those issues. So climate and sea level rise, to me, are the biggest overarching issues in Florida. Now,
Hold
the
on one
next,
second. Hold on one second. Hold on before you move on to the Everglades. All right, I want to circle back. And you know, I one of the most disappointing thing to me about the election was that there was no discussion about the environment, climate change. None whatsoever. I cannot understand for the life of me. You're not dealing with a theoretical concept. You're not dealing with, okay, well, the sea level is rising in some places, and in 50 years from now, it's going to be underwater. Who cares about that or whatever? You're talking about wildfires. You're talking about visible impact of this issue that's right in your face. You're breathing it. How could you not talk about it? Then on top of it, which you've mentioned a few times, you're going to have insurance problems that have already happened. You already have insurance carriers that have left the state of Florida and California because it's too risky. And it's too risky because of the climate change. And so why this was not discussed at all in the elections was something to me that really was a major, major head scratcher. And I think for our, you know, our folks, we need to message better. We need to get the message out there. And one of the reasons, before we get back into your discussion, that I brought you on here, and one of the things that I learned when we first met was that when the more pro-environmental administration loses out, typically you have nonprofits like the Sierra Club or, you know, whatever other organizations that are out there that fundraise very effectively, man up or woman up, and get ready for the fight. And I feel like there's been so much tumult over the politics over the last 8 years that we're tired and we've thrown in the towel. And that's not what I want to happen. I would rather go back to the days where, okay, we lost. Now we're going to donate to our time, our effort, our money to the Sierra Clubs of the world and start the fight. Because the law, whether we have to go to court, whether we have to work on the local level or the state level, we've got to do something. The third thing I want to say before you get back to talking about Florida and the Everglades is just, you know, that, all right, I'm going to let you talk because I'm doing more than talking. You know, don't work me up here. All right, so let's get back to the Everglades.
We'll get there soon. But your point, I think, comes back to something I said a few minutes ago. From my view, the Biden administration is the strongest environmental presidency of my modern, mature adult life. And I think that Vice President Harris would have been at least as strong on environmental issues. Why isn't it talked about enough on the campaign trail? Why isn't it a major debate topic? I think it comes back to the point I made about education, right? When people poll, the majority of voters do not list the environment, climate, habitat loss, biodiversity as a top voting issue. Candidates are going to respond to the issues that they see voters care about. And that's why I said we are not going to really permanently change the game in a way it needs to be changed quickly until we've got a populace, a voting populace that is far more educated as to the importance of these issues and will elevate those to the top of their list when they're choosing candidates. So moving, translating that to the Everglades and habitat loss. We live in a long, narrow state with some of the most incredible wildlife habitat, natural areas in the entire country. We have bisected it with roads, and we know what a problem that is. And it's fixing to be 2025, and we're still planning to build more roads through those ever shrinking, ever bisected, fragmented forests, wildlife areas in the state of Florida. We are converting by the 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 acre chunks, rural farmland that are used by our wildlife, converting them to suburbs. And, we're not converting them to these well-planned, mixed-use, high-density, use land really efficient and preserve the important stuff kind of suburbs. No, we're not doing that at all. It's 2025, and we are still acting like we have an unlimited amount of land in Florida. We are still converting 1,000-acre chunks of rural land to these large lot subdivisions that are not walkable. You got to get in a car to go anywhere, to do anything, and we're leaving scraps around them for wildlife to be connected to different populations. We're leaving scraps as buffers for land to prevent flooding from rivers and creeks, scraps for wildlife corridors. The conversion of rural and habitat land to, I hate to say it, but schlock Florida development remains a huge problem. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we've known is horrible for at least the last 50 years. But, all these great ideas and plans and science, you got any county commission meeting or a city council meeting in Florida, and it's as though it's the end of World War II, and we have all this land to deal with, and we have no finite resources, and we're approving development just like it was 50 years ago, and we haven't learned a thing. We just have never come to terms with the finite amount of land and water that we have in Florida. We are outstripping our carrying capacity. We are sucking so much water out of the ground to feed lawns and to feed unsustainable farming and agriculture, particularly like in the sugar fields south of Lake Okeechobee, that we are depleting aquifers, and we're allowing salt water to intrude into our drinking water, freshwater aquifers. We have exceeded the carrying capacity. We've got animals that are on the verge of extinction because they can't get from one hub to another because of roads and suburbs that are halting their ability to move around. And we're just not coming to terms with that at all. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in the Everglades. We've been trying to fix that problem for a few decades in the Everglades. The comprehensive Everglades restoration plan is an excellent plan. It's undone yet. It takes decades to undo a lot of the bad canals we dug. It takes decades to buy land, engineer these projects to store water like nature used to. And what we're in terms of the Everglades for restoring them, it's a race against time. You're not going to do that overnight. It's going to take a few decades. We're already about 25 years into, or more actually, of the meat of Everglades restoration projects. There's still so much land to be acquired, to be restored, so much re-engineering of how water moves, where and when, that we're still losing out land we've known for decades we need to restore, because local governments who don't necessarily see it as their responsibility, they're granting new development approvals for the very land, or right next door to the very land that we need to get to restore the Everglades. I mean, you're not going to get that stuff back. We have one shot to get it right. And I think we have a really excellent Everglades restoration plan and Everglades restoration project, and infrastructure that really could work. If I see the biggest variable is local government decisions. So I'm going to put it to you this way: we're trying to restore the Everglades on a spatial area that just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller because of land use decisions. At some point, we're running out of the critical mass of land we need for that system to work like human beings need it to work, in terms of providing fresh water for us all to drink and providing flood protection with increased water, sea level rise as a further complication. And so that's one of the biggest issues in Florida, is the continued loss of land to bad development decisions. And it's not like we need all that land to house everybody that wants to move to Florida. We already have enough land planned and zoned for residential development in the state of Florida, including in South Florida, for decades worth of our future population growth. What we're doing instead is gratuitously approving developments that we don't really need to meet our population demands. A lot of people want to put it as, oh, we have to give people a place to live. They're coming, right? Well, number one, we don't have to subsidize that, okay, by making it artificially cheap to live here. And number two, let them move where we've already been planning development. But what we do is, a particular developer, landowner buys land, and whatever, that other land may be zoned for development, but not the land I just bought and that I have a swell plan to develop. And then that political pressure results in that land being developed too. And we're not really using our land efficiently at all. And we're prematurely developing land we need to restore not just the Everglades, but other ecosystems, creeks, rivers, forests in the interior and northern and north central Florida. The issues, the details of the exact nature of the issue is different, but it's the same everywhere. We are losing habitat to development when we don't really need to. We've had a growth management law since 1985 that for many years the state did a great job of its role of overseeing development and saying, hey, these are statewide implications of all these individual development decisions local governments make. But in all honesty, we have not had an administration running the state in terms of at the governor level that wanted to play the state's role in overseeing land use planning for a very long time. And so we have the ability for the state to oversee local government land use planning decisions, but by and large, it has sort of abdicated that responsibility. That's a huge problem.
Do you know of young pro-environmental potential political politicians that are on the rise up in Florida that we should keep our eyes open for, support, encourage, maybe your wife?
Well, I don't want to name names. My wife would be great at that. I think that we do have some individuals, Democrats and Republicans in the state of Florida, who are really good on the environment. The problem is that the state of Florida is really run by leadership, and it's really hard for an individual state senator or state legislator, a member of the House, to really have an impact if the leadership, the Speaker of the House or the Senate President or the governor, is not rallying enough votes to make it happen. We've had some really good people on both sides of the aisles come come up with good ideas and try to be helpful, but unless you have leadership exercising its really enormous power, nothing gets done anywhere near at the level that we need it to in Florida. So, the people that have the power are the voters. And it comes back to what I talked about earlier. 2 years from now, when we're having the next round of a gubernatorial election, and who's going to be your state legislature, I'll bet a whole bunch of people that listen into this podcast can't name their two state legislators. That needs to change. And making sure that the people who are asking your vote to represent you in the state legislature or in the governor's mansion um, demonstrate a real understanding of environmental issues and commit to prioritizing them over other issues. Things aren't going to change until that changes, until voters make it clear. I'm not voting for anybody who's not going to do that. Okay, and so that'd be my take on that issue.
All right, I want to end this discussion with you and what you do, because you might be helpful on certain levels in the environmental space in Florida, maybe even in the DC area. I know you're spending some time there, but you haven't left Florida. Richard's, has spent a lot of time in the nonprofit space, academics, Nova Southeastern, and now you have moved out, I think it's been 2 years, into the private space, still doing environmental work. So talk about the kinds of things that you do that maybe people are out there and like, wow, this project is coming out right next door and it's in a wetland or whatever. What can you do to help people? What are you working?
I'm doing right now. I'm still doing some land use work. The things I talked about earlier, converting large rural areas to suburbs, changing the rules, bizarrely, changing the rules on how many hotel rooms you can build, how big, how tall the buildings can be on barrier islands that are in Fort Myers Beach, Captiva Island, Siesta Key, and Sarasota County. Bizarrely, local government responses to those areas being tragically uh, hit by hurricanes, sometimes two in a row. The response has been, let's change the rules to make it easier to build even more hotel rooms.
Yeah.
In these areas. So I've been fighting a lot of that on behalf of local citizens, local communities. The state of Florida has been making it increasingly difficult to litigate land use and zoning decisions by automatic attorney's fees if you try and lose, even if you had a really strong, good faith case, but making it just so expensive and so difficult. And so, I think that lawyers like myself are trying to do a little bit more policy work, work with agencies when they're still in the decision-making process to try to get them to see the light and make the best decisions possible so that we can avoid going to court. Litigation, going to court is always going to be a necessary component of trying to protect the environment. But there are just certain types of laws where it's just too difficult, too expensive to not put a lot of effort, time, money, resources into the advocacy part of things. My big message to people is that be involved early at the decision-making process, your city, your county, your state agency, your federal agency, because relying on winning the day at the end when a bad decision gets made with a big lawsuit, those are not great odds, and they're really expensive. And so I personally am trying to do a lot more work educating agency staffers, local, et cetera, on climate issues, sea level rise issues. There's often at the agency staff level, including agency lawyers, incorrect perceptions about what can be done. We have still this ethic that government can't regulate strictly when it comes to the environment, climate, sea level rise, and all that. And that's wrong. It's just flat wrong. Even with some of the bad things the Florida legislature has done in the recent years, we've got a really strong set of laws that authorize really great land use protection, environmental protection. And a lot of what I'm trying to do these days is do a lot of public speaking, a lot of consulting to get local elected officials, lawyers, planning staff, environmental staff to understand that they really do have a lot of power to protect their public, their communities, their special places. And they are not required to say yes to bad development in the wrong place. So those are the kinds of things that I'm up to these days.
All right. It sounds great. You keep on keeping on. Richard Grosso, one of my mentors. Love this guy. You know, you haven't aged at all in like 20 years. I can't, you know.
You are a liar, but you are a good man.
All right. Thanks for coming on, Richard. And I know that you're going to do good things and help out, and your wife as well. Maybe we get her doing some politics in Florida, hook her up with Nikki Fried or something like that. And that'll do it for this episode of Cut to the Chase.
I appreciate what you do. It's always a pleasure, my friend.
All right. You be well. All right.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.